Okay, so it is time for my review on the first book that I read in March, which I'm very happy to be doing this review today. It's taken me a couple of days to get there, but it's also given me some time to collect my thoughts because, well, you'll find out the further I go through this video what I thought about it. Anyway, so today we are reviewing Stephen King's Pet Sematary. And as you can see at the bottom, it says the ultimate horror novel. Be sure to take that in because that will come into play when I talk about my thoughts and feelings on this book as a whole. As always with my reviews, I do open up by giving you 3 pros and 3 cons, and I might just adjust the camera just a moment. Okay, welcome back. That might be a smidgen better. I start off by giving 3 pros and 3 cons that are spoiler free. Then I go into the spoiler section where I talk about the plot of the book in a very much spoiler way. And then I end by giving you my thoughts of the book on the whole. And yeah, I'm trying to hold this book in a way where you can see it. I'll be right back. Okay, I think that's the best that we're going to get for now, but that will do. Alright, so my 3 non-spoiler pros and cons about this book. We'll start off with the cons and end on a more positive note. And my first con is an extremely big one. Ultimately, this book received 2 stars, before I go any further from me, and this con had a very major part of the reason as to why it only received 2 stars. This book does not fulfill the genre with which it has become associated. This book is meant to be a horror, and to me, nothing about it screamed horror. Now, I know that this book is loved by many. I know that this book is called one of the most horrific, one of the most terrifying books that Stephen King has ever written, and even Stephen King says it's one of the most horrifying books he's ever written. But to me, that really doesn't have me sitting very well with Stephen King, because I went into reading this book freaking out a little bit because I hadn't read a horror in a very long time, and I thought, I'm gonna have to sleep with the light on, all that kind of stuff, and it just did not read as a horror to me. Nothing about it was horrific. Nothing about it disgusted me. Nothing about it terrified me. It just was not a horror to me. And if this book was a contemporary book, and if it was genred and marketed as a contemporary book, it may have received 4 stars from me, because the plot I did love, but not for a horror. It just did not scream horror to me at all. The second con that I have about this book is that there is a lull in this book from about 3/4 of the way through until the very last section of the book. It just lulls, and you're just waiting for it to go somewhere, and I had to kind of get myself through that point, and through the slog, and that was just not fun for me at all. My final con for this book is that this book is extremely predictable, and I don't know if horrors are meant to be predictable or not, but that did not make it an enjoyable read. Again, I'm being mindful that this is the spoiler-free section, so I'll just say that things would come up that I knew were going to happen, and yet the author kind of writes it from the perspective of, oh, this should be a massive surprise for you. Well, no, not really. I kind of felt like this was going to happen anyway, and that happened so many times. I think there was only one thing that I did not predict in the whole book, and that one thing was such a minor detail, and that was just really disappointing for me. I'm not the sort of reader who has to have a journey with all these left turns and just things that you just don't expect. I'm not the sort of reader who requires that. But if I'm predicting all of the things that are going to happen in a book that is meant to scare me, it just didn't work for me. So based on those 3 things, I could not go higher than 2 stars. Couple of positives. The plot itself, if I put aside the fact that it is a horror, was a really interesting plot. I appreciated it. I grew to really enjoy the story itself. Did it frighten me? No. But again, if I look at this book as more of a contemporary book rather than a horror, the story was a good story. Might even say a little bit compelling. Yeah, I really appreciated it. My second pro is that the writing style is very, very, very easy to follow. There are a couple of cultural references in the book, not a lot, but a couple of cultural references for that time and for the area that they are in that I didn't quite know what they were referring to, and I had to do a little bit of research on, but honestly, it was so minor that it's not even a con for me. That was totally fine. But otherwise, the writing style is so easy to follow, and it wasn't flowery writing. It was very simplistic, and I appreciate that. Having read extremely flowery writing, having read authors who have such a complicated writing style that's really tough to wrap my head around what they're trying to get me to read here, before I can even really start appreciating the plot itself. In each sentence, I'm having to like dissect words and try and work out, what are you telling me? I need to translate this before I can start enjoying the story. Pet Sematary was an extremely easy read. No issues with the writing style whatsoever. No, I admit I was waiting for that to happen. So let's hope it will stay. It's leaning. It doesn't want to stay, but let's hope it stays. I really should invest in a, what do you call those things? A book holder thing. We have them at work. I wonder if I can just purchase one from work. Anyway, because that might be better for me. Let's try and move on to the next thing, and I'll try not to worry that the book's going to fall over. My final pro for this story is most of the characters. I kind of came in here thinking I would point out one character, but most of the characters, I really appreciated them. The protagonist's stepfather, I do not appreciate at all, and that was hard for me to read, but I'll again explain more about that in the spoiler version. But otherwise, most of the characters I really loved. I loved the protagonist, and I was very invested in him throughout the story. I grew to love the second character, the side character, whatever you want to call it. So the man that becomes the protagonist's friend. So in case you didn't know, the protagonist right at the beginning, he moves into a new house that's in a completely different area from where they were living, and they make friends across the road, this elderly couple, and the husband in the elderly couple and the husband, who is the main character, become really good friends, and I appreciated both characters, so that is another pro for me. But yeah, if you do not want to know any spoilers, I am going to wrap this up here for you and say that if you want to read a horror that will allow you to go to bed at night with the light off, this is a great book for you to read. Now, a lot of people, gosh, seriously, a lot of people are not going to agree with me on that. A lot of people are going to say, what are you talking about, Mr. Francy? This is the most horrific book that I've ever read. How can you sit here and say that you can go to bed with the light off? But I certainly could. And I'm going to make this statement for you. I have read many YA, young adult books that are far scarier than this thing. I've also read a ton of YA supernatural books and YA fantasy books. And I think the only element that might be scary for some, it wasn't for me, and I can't stomach horror movies, so that says a lot for me. I really can't, but I wanted to try reading horror books. The only thing that might be seen as a horror for some people is that there is a supernatural element to the book, and that might sit rather uncomfortably with some people, but with me, I was totally fine with it. And it just, I don't know, if this book was written with the intention to scare me, it didn't do it. It was a good book. It was great. It did not scare me. It did not disgust me. It did not fill me with any sort of terror whatsoever, which is what a horror is meant to do. So I know that Stephen King is famous for his horror books, and I don't mean any disrespect at all to Stephen King, but maybe, in my opinion, Pet Sematary, other than being known as the ultimate horror novel, should be known as the ultimate contemporary fun story to read. I mean, that's just my opinion. So if you're looking for a horror that is, and you've read many fantasy stories, or you've read many paranormal stories, whether they be YA or adult, and you want a horror that you'll be able to go to sleep with the light on, sorry, with the light off, Pet Sematary is perfect because it's really not that horrific as far as I'm concerned. But I will leave that there. That will end my spoiler-free segment. And when I come back, we will be discussing full-on spoilers about this book, starting off with the plot of this book. What is this book about? Spoiler version will be there right after this. Don't go away. Okay, and welcome back to my spoiler version. For those of you who have stuck around, you can see the novel a little more clearly than you could before. This is it's a long novel. It has a lot of pages, but the size of the book itself is shorter than others that I've read, so that's why it kind of dipped. So I apologize about that. But let's get right into this because we really don't have a lot of time, and I have a lot to say about the plot and my thoughts as well. So let's get right into the plot. Basically, Pet Sematary is a story about this man, Lewis Creed. His wife, I almost said his husband there, which would have made this a horror LGBTQ plus story, but no. He and his wife, which is totally fine, he and his wife and their daughter and son move into a new house, and yeah, because Lewis Creed is a person who works in the medical profession, and he has just been given a job to work in the triage area of a college, I do believe. It really does not become a big deal where exactly he works. It's more what he does. And so he helps people in medically, basically. Anyway, so on his first day there at his new home, he and his wife and the kids meet this older couple, they're kind of octogenarians, across the road. We have Judd and his wife Norma, and Judd takes a liking to this family pretty quickly. I did not take a liking to him very quickly, but he grew on me. He really did grow on me throughout the book, which was really surprising. And he's basically talking to them about their house and about the area and things that go on. And then at the end of the conversation, Judd invites Lewis over to his place for a couple of beers, and Lewis ends up taking Judd up on his offer, and they become pretty good friends throughout the novel, which is really good. And this is what I mean. It feels more like a contemporary to me. A friendship trope in a contemporary novel. But anyway, so one day the wife and the two kids go to visit the wife's parents, and we learn very quickly that Lewis's father-in-law particularly does not like him at all. He is very abusive towards Lewis. At one point, particularly in the story, there is a very, I don't want to say horrific, because in the context of a horror, I don't feel like I can say this is a horror scene, because it's not. It's an abusive scene. There's an abusive scene that plays out, but I'll get to that. Anyway, they go over to visit, the wife and the two kids go over to visit the wife's parents and Lewis's in-laws, obviously, and Lewis stays behind with the house cat. Now, this is really cute. The cat is a black cat, and the cat's name is Church, named after Winston Churchill, which is just really, really cute. Anyway, the daughter loves the cat. It is the family's cat, but it's kind of seen unofficially as the daughter's cat, and so even before she leaves, she's like, take care of Church, make sure he's okay. And whenever she would ring, she would always ask, how's Church doing? Is he okay? Is he eating? Da, da, da. Yeah, all that kind of stuff. And I also need to give you a better idea of the book, the kids are really, really, really young. I think the daughter's in prep or grade 1 or something. Like, she's really, really, really young, and the son is even younger than her. He's not even at school yet, so they're really young kids. Anyway, while the kids are away with the mum visiting the in-laws, Church dies. Now, I do not remember why Church died. I don't remember how it happened, but he does. Anyway, so Judd discovers him before Lewis does, because he ends up dead outside of Judd's place. Judd calls Lewis and says, look, I'm sorry, because he woke him up in the middle of the night. I'm sorry to wake you, but I found a dead cat outside my house and I think it might be yours. You may want to come over and have a bit of a look and make sure it is, or whatever. So Lewis goes over, and indeed there's no mistaking that it is Church. And they put Church into a bag, and then they have a couple of beers and just talk about the fact that Church has died. And suddenly Judd announces he's going to take Lewis somewhere where he can bury Church, which ends up being this pet cemetery. Now, the pet cemetery had come up in their first discussion when Judd first meets the family, but he spoke about it with the daughter and basically was just saying it in a nice way. Oh, there's a pet cemetery up there, and one day I might take you there if you want, No real big deal. So Lewis says, look, maybe I'll do it tomorrow or whatever. And Judd says, no, look, trust me, you'll regret it if you don't do it now. Let's go get it done. So they go over to the pet cemetery, and Lewis thinks that Judd is going to help him bury the cat, but Judd makes this big bells and whistle about, no, you have to do it yourself. It has to be you who buries it. Okay, fine. So Lewis buries the cat, and then they go home. And the next day, the cat is back. So we learn very quickly, and I kind of figured this would be the case anyway coming into the book, and that's why to me this was not horrific at all, but any pet that you bury in the cemetery comes back alive. So that's what happened. Church, I almost said Winston. Instead I said Churchill, but his name is Church. Church comes back alive and goes back home, pretty much like nothing happened. And the only real big difference is that his eyes are yellow and really bright. The way he acts is very different though, and it's noticeable for Lewis. Lewis decides not to tell the daughter anything because as far as he thinks she'll be concerned, the cat is still there. So, But when the daughter comes home, she starts noticing things right away. He is really smelly, and no matter how many baths they give him, or try to anyway, because have you ever tried to give a cat a bath? I mean, I used to have cats, so I get that. But, he's acting really mean. He's being really weird. One night when Lewis puts his little son to bed, he notices right before he walks out of the room that the cat is literally sitting inside the cupboard, glaring out at the kid who is sleeping. That's a little bit freaky. I don't call it horrific though. And before anything can even happen or even think about happening, Lewis has gotten the cat out of the room anyway by chucking one of the kids' toys at the cat to make it move, because he tries to get the cat to move by verbally going, get out of here, but the cat won't move. So he chucks a toy at the cat and the cat moves and leaves the room. So nothing happens in that scene. See what I mean? The horror just doesn't come. Anyway, because I was thinking at that point, oh, maybe the cat's going to attack the kid, or maybe the cat will attack the family and kill the family, but spoiler, that does not happen at all in the entire book. The cat doesn't do anything to kill the family. But anyway, fine. So then we get into a little bit of a slump, but it's still fine. As I said, if it were a contemporary, it'd be, just checking the time there, 18 minutes in, it would be totally fine. And then the next thing we know, Gage is dead. And I literally mean that. The next thing we know, he's dead. Because the chapter opens up basically saying Gage is dead. And then it goes back and explains how Gage died. So, yeah. And what I didn't appreciate about both the cat's death and about Gage's death is that we don't actually see this happen. With the cat, we have no idea how it died. And with Gage, even though we're told what happened, it is a retelling after the fact, and it's very brief. Apparently, he was running around and laughing and having fun out in the front open area. There's no gates or anything, so between Lewis's house and Judd's house, and he's just running around, and then he runs towards the road. Lewis runs after him, hoping to catch him, but unfortunately, Gage successfully makes it to the road as a truck is coming along, and the truck hits Gage, and Gage is now dead. for the sake of a horror, I wish they had made it sound more horrific. Now, I'm not saying that the death of a child is not a horrific thing. Please don't think I'm saying that. But for the sake of this being a fantasy world, as far as I'm concerned, because it's a book, it's non-fiction, I really thought that with it being a horror, an adult horror at that, that they would go into so much more detail about how the kid died and made it seem so much more horrific, but it was very simplistically explained. The kid was hit by a truck and he flew a few feet, and by the time he landed on the ground, he was dead. It was very simplistically written. Um, anyway, so then they have the funeral, and or after the funeral, but still in the church, we see how much Lewis's father-in-law despises him, so much so that he sits behind Lewis at one point when everyone else has left the church area. Lewis is sitting on one of the pews. His stepfather sits behind him and starts really grating him by whispering all these harsh things into his ear about how it's his fault and how he always told his daughter never to marry scum like that, and da-da-da-da. And it's just ridiculous. And then eventually he just gets louder and louder, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And then he basically hits him, hits or slaps him. The father-in-law hits or slaps Lewis, and then Lewis falls over in shock just because he didn't expect it to happen. And he starts kicking him while he's on the ground, and it was horrible. Not a horror story. Again, I feel like this should be a contemporary story because it is abuse, but it's not a horror as far as I'm concerned. Because if abuse was horror, then it would not appear in any other genre of book. And believe you me, it does appear in many different genres. So I don't specifically want to file that away as a horror. Abuse is very horrific. I don't talk about this on my channel, but I have gone through abuse before in my life, quite a few times growing up, and I don't want to talk about that. So I do want to say that I understand that it's not a nice thing to have happen to you, but for the sake of reviewing a book that is a horror, I just didn't find it specifically to be a horror set abuse. I found it more to be a contemporary styled abuse. Anyway, so after all that happens, Lewis starts thinking about what happened with the cat and how when he buried the cat came back alive. Maybe he can do this with Lewis, but how to get the wife and his daughter out of the house. So he suggests that they go back with her parents to their place and spend some time with them. The wife doesn't want to go, but eventually she agrees. She and the daughter go away, and then we really hit a slog because Lewis takes a lot of time debating whether or not he's going to bury the kid. But by this point, I kind of got the sense from the moment he first thought about it that it would happen. So to me, it was predictable that he was going to do it. It's just it took him forever to do it. And to me, I don't think horrors are meant to be relatable to the average human. So I think to me, it's meant to be a fantasy world from the author's perspective. And so to me, the fact that it took him forever and a day to decide that he is going to bury his son was not something that I appreciated. Now, had this been a non-fiction book, I absolutely would have appreciated it. But for a fiction book, I just didn't like how it took him forever to determine that he was going to do this. Eventually, he does end up burying his son, and his son does come back. Now, I want it known that I had not one issue with the cat coming back. I had not one issue with him burying the son, because quite frankly, I got where he was coming from. If you bury someone in that cemetery, they come back to life. He is mourning and grieving the loss of his son, and he can get him back. He won't be exactly the same, but he can get him back. So let's bury him in the pet cemetery. For the sake of this being a fictional book, I was all for it, and I didn't find it horrific at all. The kid comes back, and ultimately... so ultimately what happens is, back with the mum and the daughter who are with the in-laws, the daughter wakes up from having a horrible nightmare, and she starts telling her mum about the nightmare. Now, I need to go back to the beginning because I forgot to mention this. On Lewis's first day on his job at the college, he tries to help a boy who has come in who looks like he's going to die because he's suffering from major injuries. He's bleeding out of like primary areas. It's really horrific. Not horrific for a horror, but horrific for like a medical book. But he doesn't end up saving him, and this kid's name is Pascal. Lewis ends up having some dreams about Pascal, but doesn't really think too much about it. I mean, well, I don't anyway. The daughter has a dream about Pascal and relays it to her mum. And the more the daughter talks to her mum about the dream, the more the mum starts getting worried, because how will the daughter know all these different things that have occurred that they've never told her? So the mum starts getting extremely worried and decides she's going to go home. She tries to ring Lewis, but Lewis is not home. The reason he's not home is because he's gone to a hotel to stay the night before he buries his son. I never really understood why he went to a hotel. I don't know. I just personally didn't get it. He was home alone, so it didn't make sense to me. But anyway, that's what he decided to do. So the mum decides she's going to go home and make sure that everything's okay. She's going to leave the daughter behind and check everything out. On the way home, she ends up having some trouble, but eventually she ends up getting a rental car and starts driving home, and she calls Judd to find out what's going on. Judd said, look, you deserve to know, but I'll tell you when you get here. When you arrive here, come directly to me. I'll tell you what's going on, but listen, do yourself a favor, because she's been traveling for a very long time at this point. He says, do yourself a favor, pull over somewhere, get some rest, and then come back, because it's not worth you having an accident. And she goes, yeah, okay, I will, and then I'll come and see you. She then hangs up the phone and keeps driving. This was the one thing that surprised me. The one thing I could not have predicted was the wife racing home and continuing to race home despite the fact she's told Judd, I won't keep driving, I'll stop off, because she doesn't seem like the sort of person who's going to lie to anyone. So that surprised me, but it's such a minor part of the story. She arrives at Judd's home and she can see that that there's no one at her home, or yeah, I think so. Anyway, she knocks on the door and Judd does not come running. Then she sees her cat. She sees Church, and then Church basically tells her to go upstairs. At least in her mind, he does. She goes upstairs and she sees Judd dead. I forgot to say earlier on in the book, Norma dies. Norma ends up dying of some natural condition. So it wasn't a big horrific death. She was dying anyway, but you just need to know, for the sake of context, that she had already died about a quarter of the way into the book. So Judd's now dead, and behind him is Gage, to which she's of course really shocked to see Gage. This is the first time we see Gage, and he basically runs up to his mum in a baby voice and says, Mummy, Mummy, I missed you, and I've got a surprise for you. Now, I have an inkling that the surprise was that he had a knife behind his back, but it was never stated. We didn't see anything, and the next thing we know, the mum is dead. So again, we don't see these horrific scenes. They don't play out. So it's not horrific to me. If you're not going to write it in the story, how can you pass this off as a horror? I just don't get it. But anyway, so then the mum ends up dead, and Lewis, I don't actually remember how it concluded, so it didn't really stay with me. I think Lewis ended up killing Gage somehow. I don't remember how it ended. But yeah, that didn't take much either. I wish I remember what happened. I don't. But I think Lewis ended up killing Gage, and it was just a quick stab and he was dead. And this is what I mean. It just wasn't horrific. All these horror movies that I've seen that have done everything that a horror is meant to do, it terrified me. It was completely horrific. It disgusted me. This book just did not do that. So I found that a little bit disappointing. I have a couple of minutes to quickly wrap up my thoughts on this book, and that is absolutely one of them. It just, for a horror, it just did nothing that a horror should do. And that's why it couldn't get more than 2 stars. If it was a contemporary book, though, for the reasons I've already explained, it would have received 4 stars because it was a great story. But it's a horror, and I was waiting to be scared, and it never happened. So, and I struggle through some of what some people call the lamest horror movies out there. I struggle to watch them, but this was really easy to read. The next thing I want to say is that I didn't need as much grief as this book discusses. And you're going to see a lot of people on YouTube, if you see a lot of different reviews on Pet Sematary, who talk about how much they appreciate that this book talks so much about grief and it helped them process their grief, and therefore they love this book so much because of all the things it does for grief, which is wonderful. But for me, I did not go into this book wanting to deal with grief. I went into this book wanting to have a horrific experience, and I did not have one. And it annoyed me that it dealt so much with grief. If anything, this should be called, instead of being called the ultimate horror novel, it should be called the ultimate helping you deal with grief novel, to which I would not have read it then, because I didn't want to read about that. It's just not, it's not to say that I don't grieve when people pass away, I do, but it's just not something that I wanted to read about. If it was, I would have found a contemporary book specifically that deals with that. So that was a letdown for me. Surprising pro was Judd for me and his character arc over the entire story. The first couple of pages with him, I just did not like him. I was hoping he would fall into the background. He was just not the sort of character that I generally have any investment in, any sympathy for, or empathy for at all. Just personal preference. And yeah, I thought, okay, he'll just melt into the background and we won't deal with him again because, you know, they're going to bury the cat and the cat's going to kill everyone. I mean, come on, Stephen King. It would have been a much better ending, in my opinion. But his character literally grew on me throughout the story, and by the end, I grew to love Judd Crawley, I believe his name is, so much. One thing I really appreciated was there is a scene where Lewis and his stepfather get to have they chat over the phone while the wife and the daughter are back home with the in-laws post the son dying, and the father-in-law apologizes for everything he's done, and he makes certain that Lewis knows it's a genuine apology, and that was a really beautiful moment. They agreed to let bygones be bygones and start again, and I really appreciated that. I don't think enough books really do that. Take something that is years old issues and say, you know what, let's just leave this, especially between men. Let's just let this go and start again. And that was just a really beautiful scene for me. I just keep checking the time because we're going to run out of time soon. All in all, I loved the story. I did. And I don't want anyone to think, oh, Mr. Francy didn't love the story. I did. I loved the story. I loved the plot. But it's not a horror, in my opinion, and it should not be categorized as such, because being that it is, you go into it expecting to be scared, and I was not scared once, and that was a real letdown. Word of contemporary, 4 stars, but it is a horror, so 2 stars from me. And that is where I'm going to leave it, because I'm about to be cut off, letting you guys go peace, blessings, and so much love. If you've read this, or if you do decide to read it, let me know what you think in the comments below. But until then, mwah, happy reading. Bye, guys. Bye.